have never in my career seen such a complete failure of corporate controls." That wasn't a statement about some forgotten industrial firm. It came from John J. Ray III, the man who cleaned up the wreckage of Enron. His verdict was for a company that just months earlier was valued at $32 billion. $32 billion, enough to buy an entire NFL team twice over. A valuation that dwarfed legacy corporations built in just 3 years. This was FTX, the supposed future of finance, with its name plastered on stadiums and its ads starring champions like Tom Brady. It was helmed by a mop-haired wonderkind in a t-shirt. Sam Bankman-Fried wasn't just building a company. He was architecting a new paradigm for the global economy. Then, in the space of a single week, it all evaporated. Over 1 million creditors, from sophisticated hedge funds to ordinary savers, woke up to find their accounts frozen, their life savings vaporized. After seeing the system that celebrated him, was Sam Bankman-Fried a mastermind fraudster or just a convenient scapegoat for a broken industry? Tell me your answer in the comments. I read and replied to every single one. Because this pattern of blaming a lone wolf isn't new. It's a playbook. In our next video, we expose how one man was blamed for the entire 2010 flash crash. Subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't lose access to the truth. And share this with someone who needs to see it. The initial shockwave of panic and disorientation sent markets reeling. The official narrative, spun by its founder even as the walls caved in, was one of a liquidity crunch, a bank run in the digital age, a complex, unfortunate failure of a misunderstood technology. But that story was a deliberate fiction, a smokescreen for something far more cynical. What was happening behind closed doors, inside a $30 million Bahamian penthouse, was a story as old as money itself. At its core, the collapse wasn't driven by an esoteric flaw in blockchain mechanics. Unraveling the chaos reveals that the architecture of this entire global empire was built on a deception so audacious, it was practically invisible. This wasn't the failure of a decentralized dream. It was the meticulous construction of a very centralized house of cards, controlled by a tiny, insulated inner circle. The fallout was immediate and catastrophic. But as investigators began sifting through the wreckage, one question, pulled directly from the company's own bankruptcy filings, silenced all others. Where did the money go? How does $8 billion of customer funds simply vanish into thin air? To understand the $8 billion hole, you first have to understand the scale of the image being projected. Sam Bankman-Fried wasn't just a CEO. He was becoming a political force, the second largest individual donor to the Democratic Party in the 2022 election cycle, spending around $40 million to shape policy in Washington. FTX wasn't just an app. It was a cultural icon, spending over $300 million to put its name on the Miami Heat's arena and into Super Bowl commercials with celebrities like Larry David, all while the company's inner circle directed this global operation from a luxury penthouse in the Bahamas. This wasn't just a company. It was a meticulously constructed veneer of legitimacy. But behind the exchange everyone saw, there was the company few understood, Alameda Research, SBF's private hedge fund. The public promise, the bedrock of trust for FTX's millions of users, was that a thick wall existed between the two. Alameda was just another client. FTX was the neutral casino. Alameda was just a player at the table. Any hint that the house was also the biggest gambler would shatter the entire illusion. The first crack appeared on November 2nd, 2022. A leaked balance sheet published by CoinDesk showed that the emperor had no clothes. Of Alameda's $14.6 billion in assets, a staggering portion consisted of FTT, the crypto token that FTX itself had created out of thin air. It was the financial equivalent of a national bank claiming its primary reserve asset is just stacks of its own freshly printed, uncirculated currency. This revelation was the kindling. 6 days later, the CEO of FTX's chief rival, Binance, threw a lit match. In a single tweet, he announced his firm would be liquidating its entire FTT position, worth over $500 million, citing recent revelations. That tweet triggered a catastrophic bank run, a crisis of confidence that vaporized billions in value in mere hours. The speed of the collapse was breathtaking, but the real story isn't the panic. It's the architecture that made the panic possible. This brings us to two inescapable questions. How did a trading firm, lauded for its quantitative genius, build its foundation on a self-referential house of cards? And more disturbingly, just how deep did the connection between Alameda and FTX actually run? Sam Bankman-Fried was adamant. repeatedly insisting that Alameda was just another market participant. Their account is just like everyone else's, he claimed. A thick, impenetrable wall stood between the exchange and his private hedge fund. That was the foundational promise, the bedrock of trust for millions of users. But was it true? Was the casino's biggest, most aggressive gambler really playing by the same rules? The answer, buried deep within the system's architecture, wasn't just a simple no. It was a categorical betrayal of the entire premise of a fair exchange. And this is where the story pivots from a market crash into a far more unsettling investigation. The fallout from FTX forces a nuclear question. Is this merely a story of spectacular, old-school fraud dressed up in the complex language of crypto? A tale of a few uniquely corrupt individuals hijacking a revolutionary technology for personal gain? Or is the problem more systemic? Is there something inherent in this new financial world that doesn't just permit this kind of collapse, but actively cultivates the conditions for it? A system where accountability can be coded out of existence. Unraveling the answer is the key to everything. It's how you explain an $8 billion hole, and it all begins with a specific, hidden feature in the code. A privilege that made Alameda unlike any other account on Earth. That impenetrable wall Sam Bankman-Fried spoke of? It was a complete fiction. In fact, court testimony from his closest associates, Gary Wang and Caroline Ellison, reveals the opposite was true. The architecture of FTX wasn't built with a wall. It was built with a secret passage. On any legitimate exchange, there's a mechanism called liquidation engine. It's the system's guardrail. If you make a bad trade and your collateral drops too low, the engine automatically closes your position to prevent catastrophic losses. It's a fundamental rule of the game, applied to everyone, except Alameda. According to sworn testimony, Alameda Research had a unique privilege coded directly into the exchange. Their accounts were exempt from the liquidation engine. This feature, a kind of digital get-out-of-jail-free card, allowed Alameda to do the impossible, maintain a negative balance. While every other user had to post collateral, Alameda could effectively borrow from an infinite pool of money, a pool filled with FTX customer deposits. The new CEO, John J. Ray III, described it in his official filings as a complete failure of corporate controls. But it wasn't a failure. It was a feature. This wasn't a bug in the system. It was the system itself, operating exactly as designed. Alameda wasn't just another player. It was the house, using a stacked deck. At its core, this one technical exemption is the key. It's the mechanism that allowed a private hedge fund to drain billions from a public exchange, all while its founder was on stage selling a vision of a more transparent, equitable financial future. What kind of person builds something like this? To understand the architect, you have to go back to the blueprint. Sam Bankman-Fried wasn't a product of the crypto-anarchist fringe. He was a creature of the establishment, meticulously engineered for success. A graduate of MIT, with a mind honed at Jane Street Capital, the notoriously quantitative and secretive Wall Street trading firm. This wasn't just a job. It was an intellectual forge, a place where probability and logic were the only recognized deities. But for SBF, something was missing. The pure accumulation of wealth was an empty equation. He found his purpose in a philosophy that was sweeping through Silicon Valley and elite academia: effective altruism, a coldly rational, data-driven approach to philanthropy. The goal wasn't just to do good. It was to calculate and execute the most good possible. And the most efficient way to do that, he reasoned, was to get staggeringly, uncomfortably rich. His ascension began with an arbitrage opportunity so perfect it feels like a legend: the kimchi premium. In 2017, Bitcoin was trading at a significant markup on South Korean exchanges. SBF and his small team at the newly formed Alameda Research saw the inefficiency. They began a frantic, globe-spanning operation to buy Bitcoin in the US and sell it in Asia, capturing the spread. It was a money-printing machine, a validation of his entire thesis. The financial system was full of irrationalities, and a superior intellect could exploit them for a higher purpose. This early success gave him the capital and, more importantly, the credibility to build his magnum opus, FTX. It was pitched as the exchange built by traders, for traders, faster, smarter, and more reliable than anything else on the market. Venture capital saw a unicorn in the making. They saw a founder who spoke their language, a wonderkind with the pedigree of Wall Street and the messianic vision of a new age philanthropist. They weren't just investing in a company. They were backing a new paradigm for finance. But the machine built on logic was run on chaos. Behind the scenes, Alameda was a high-wire act without a net. The firm took colossal, leveraged bets that repeatedly brought it to the brink of annihilation. In one now infamous incident, a flawed trade on a minor cryptocurrency hemorrhaged millions of dollars a minute. In the crypto winter of 2021, as markets plunged, Alameda's balance sheet was decimated. Any normal trading firm, bound by the rules of risk and collateral, would have been wiped out. The story should have ended there. In an interview, SBF himself admitted his comfort with risk, stating, "I'm happy to be in a position where I have a 50% chance of making a ton of money and a 50% chance of making nothing." For most, that's a coin flip. For SBF, it was a mandate. But what happens when the coin lands on the wrong side? Over and over again. How do you keep playing when the house should have already taken all your chips? This is the critical turn. Unraveling the story reveals that Alameda didn't survive these catastrophes through sheer trading genius. It survived because its founder had engineered a solution, a private backstop that made the firm immune to failure. As FTX grew into a behemoth, processing billions in daily volume, Alameda's trading became even more reckless, more audacious. It operated with a level of confidence that baffled competitors, seemingly unbound by the normal constraints of capital. They weren't just flipping a coin anymore. They were playing a game where they knew, with absolute certainty, it would never land on tails. The question that sophisticated investors failed to ask was brutally simple. How? The answer wasn't in their public strategy. It was hidden, deep in the architecture of FTX itself. A quiet, custom-built feature that turned the world's most sophisticated new exchange into a private, bottomless piggy bank. The answer to how Alameda survived, how it played a game where the coin never landed on tails, wasn't found in a complex trading algorithm or a stroke of market genius. It was found in a single line of code. A feature, not a bug, confirmed in sworn testimony by FTX's own co-founder and CTO, Gary Wang. Internally, it was a simple database flag, a Boolean value, true or false, but its function was so powerful, so fundamentally game-breaking, that it effectively served as a god key to the entire exchange. You see, the public believed Alameda was simply exempt from auto-liquidation. That was the first layer of the deception. The reality was far more profound. This flag didn't just prevent Alameda's bad bets from being closed. It allowed its accounts to go negative, infinitely negative, while over 1 million FTX users had to post real assets as collateral for every trade. Alameda could draw on a phantom balance that had no ceiling. According to court filings, this secret line of credit was not just a few $1,000,000 for liquidity. By 2022, it had swelled to an astonishing $65 billion. At its core, the mechanism was brutally simple. When Alameda needed money to cover catastrophic trading losses, to make venture investments, or to fund a $300 million marketing blitz, it simply withdrew funds from FTX. If the funds weren't in Alameda's account, the system didn't care. It just let the balance drop, creating a negative liability on FTX's books. But where did the actual cash, the dollars in Bitcoin, come from? It came from the accounts of every other user on the platform. It was your money. This isn't a complex derivative. It isn't a sophisticated financial instrument. Unraveling the technical jargon reveals a structure that is almost primitive in its audacity. This is the digital equivalent of a bank letting one special customer withdraw unlimited funds, and then covering the shortfall by quietly taking a little bit of money from every other savings account in the building. This wasn't a crypto firm acting like a bank. This was a crypto firm acting like the most reckless, pre-2008 investment bank imaginable, but with none of the oversight and direct access to customer deposits. And they spent it lavishly. Court filings show SBF and other executives took over $4 billion in loans and payments from these entities. A staggering $543 million was allegedly borrowed by SBF from Alameda personally. While they were living in a $30 million Bahamian penthouse, their entire operation was being backstopped by the savings of school teachers and small business owners who believed their funds were safe. Perhaps it began as a simple coding shortcut, a way for the exchange's primary market maker to operate more efficiently. The architecture of this system, however, created a moral hazard so profound, it made this outcome almost inevitable. When you have a private, unlimited, and unaccountable source of funds, the temptation to use it becomes overwhelming. They had built a system with no guardrails, run by an inner circle who believed they were smarter than the rules of risk themselves. This was the hidden engine that powered the entire empire. The source of the venture deals, the stadium naming rights, the political donations. It was all a mirage, funded by a secret backdoor that siphoned billions from the very customers who trusted them. This was their great innovation, a new paradigm for finance. With the mechanism now exposed, the $8 billion question was finally answered. The money hadn't vanished. It had been taken, transferred, spent. The fallout was no longer about a market crash or a liquidity crisis. It was now about a crime, and the entire world was about to watch a trial that would put not just Sam Bankman-Fried, but the very promise of crypto in the dock. The trial of Sam Bankman-Fried was, in many ways, an anticlimax. The core of his defense rested on the idea that he was a brilliant but overwhelmed entrepreneur, not a criminal mastermind. But this narrative was systematically dismantled by the people who knew the system best. His own inner circle. One by one, Caroline Ellison, Gary Wang, and Nishad Singh, the architects of the empire, took the stand. Having already pleaded guilty to fraud themselves, they laid bare the deliberate deception, the secret database flags, and the conscious decision to use customer money as a private slush fund. The fallout was a guilty verdict on all counts, a decisive, legal end to the story. And yet, for the more than 1 million creditors left with nothing, and for an entire industry now facing an existential crisis, that simple conclusion feels profoundly unsatisfying. Unraveling the events leaves us stranded between two irreconcilable narratives. The first is the one presented by the prosecution, that this is a simple, timeless story of fraud. Sam Bankman-Fried was just an old-school conman who used the novel language of crypto to dress up a classic Ponzi scheme. In this version, the technology is irrelevant. The crime was pure human greed, and justice, in its slow, methodical way, was served. It's a clean narrative. It allows us to isolate the problem, assign blame, and move on. But there is a second, more disturbing possibility. That Sam Bankman-Fried wasn't an aberration, but rather the perfect, logical product of the system he inhabited. This argument suggests that the problem wasn't the man, but the very architecture of the world he was building. A world that preached decentralization while rewarding cults of personality. A world that championed a code is law ethos, making it possible to engineer accountability right out of the system. An ecosystem flush with so much speculative capital and so little regulatory oversight that it created the perfect petri dish for this exact kind of hubris to flourish. At its core, this narrative argues that FTX wasn't a perversion of the crypto dream. It was its ultimate, terrifying expression. In his flurry of interviews after the collapse, before his arrest, Bankman-Fried himself seemed unable to grasp the gravity of the crime. "I didn't ever try to commit fraud," he insisted. A statement of profound denial that forces us to question if he was a calculating liar or a true believer so lost in his own reality that he couldn't distinguish between risk-taking and outright theft. That ambiguity, the space between genius and fraudster, is where the real danger lies. It's the story we tell ourselves about visionaries who break the rules for a greater good. So, while the court has answered the question of SBF's guilt, it leaves the rest of us with a far more critical one. The facts are not in dispute. An $8 billion hole? A web of lies. A generation of investors betrayed. But placing all the blame on one man in a t-shirt is a convenient fiction. It allows the venture capitalists who fueled him, the regulators who missed him, and the entire industry that celebrated him to avoid looking in the mirror. As the dust settles on FTX, the real question isn't how one man fooled the world, but whether the architecture of crypto itself is designed to build the next house of cards. The answer to that question will define the future of digital finance. Because history shows that when a new paradigm for finance is promised, someone, somewhere, is usually paying the price.